Who hasn't heard of Warren Buffett, one of the world's richest people, consistently ranking high on Forbes' list of billionaires? His net worth was listed at $100 billion as of Sep. 2021. Buffett is known as a businessman and philanthropist. But he's probably best known for being one of the world's most successful investors. Which is why it's not surprising that Warren Buffett's investment strategy has reached mythical proportions. Buffett follows several important tenets and an investment philosophy that is widely followed around the globe. So just what are the secrets to his success? Watch on to find out more about Buffett's strategy and how he's managed to amass such a fortune from his investments. Buffett, a brief history. Warren Buffett was born in Omaha in 1930. He developed an interest in the business world and investing at an early age, including in the stock market. Buffett started his education at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania before moving back to go to the University of Nebraska, where he received an undergraduate degree in business administration. Buffett later went to the Columbia Business School where he earned his graduate degree in economics. Buffett began his career as an investment salesperson in the early 1950s but formed Buffett Associates in 1956. Less than 10 years later, in 1965, he was in control of Berkshire Hathaway. In June 2006, Buffett announced his plans to donate his entire fortune to charity. Then, in 2010, Buffett and Bill Gates announced that they formed the Giving Pledge campaign to encourage other wealthy individuals to pursue philanthropy. In 2012, Buffett announced he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He has since successfully completed his treatment. Most recently, Buffett began collaborating with Jeff Bezos and Jamie Dimon to develop a new healthcare company focused on employee healthcare. The three have tapped Brigham and App Women's Dr. Adel Gawande to serve as chief executive officer. Buffett's methodology. Warren Buffett finds low price value by asking himself some questions when he evaluates the relationship between a stock's level of excellence and its price. Keep in mind these are not the only things he analyzes, but rather, a brief summary of what he looks for in his investment approach. 1. Company performance. Sometimes return on equity, ROE, is referred to as stockholders' return on investment.
Return on equity is a measure of how efficient a company is at generating profits. Mike has to decide which company to invest in. Both Al's Ice Cream and Ed's Carpets earned $50 million this year. Each company has equity, the amount of cash received from the original investors in exchange for shares. Al's has equity of $100 million. Ed's has equity of $250 million. To calculate the return on equity, or ROE, Mike divides each company's profit by the equity. Mike finds out that Al's has an ROE of 50% and Ed's only has an ROE of 20%. Ed's Carpets had more equity to work with, but it produced the same profits as Al's Ice Cream. Put another way, Al's matched Ed's profits, despite the fact that it had less to work with. This suggests Al's is more efficient at generating profit from its equity. A good return on equity is attractive to investors. Mike goes to his stockbroker and buys shares of Al's Ice Cream. But no single measure can tell the whole story. Return on equity is one of the many metrics that investors use to evaluate a stock.
ROE is calculated as follows. ROE equals net income divided by shareholders' equity. Looking at the ROE in just the last year isn't enough. The investor should view the ROE from the past 5 to 10 years to analyze historical performance. 2. Company debt. The debt-to-equity ratio, DE, is another key characteristic Buffett considers carefully.
The debt-to-equity ratio is a measure of a company's financial leverage. Al and Ed both go to the bank for business loans. The loan officer looks at their respective balance sheets. Ed has $120,000 in assets, cash, equipment, and so on. Ed also has $100,000 in liabilities, mostly loans. So Ed's equity is $20,000. The loan officer divides Ed's liabilities by his equity to come up with a ratio of 5. This means Ed has $5 of debt for every $1 of equity. Ed is highly leveraged, so he's a high risk for the bank. His application is declined. Al's balance sheet is much stronger. Al has $150,000 in assets and only $50,000 in liabilities. His equity is $100,000. Al's debt-to-equity ratio is 0.5, $50,000 over $100,000. This means Al has 50 cents of debt for every dollar of equity. Al's low debt-to-equity ratio makes him a low risk for the bank. His application is approved. The debt-to-equity ratio identifies companies that are highly leveraged and therefore higher risk. But no single ratio can tell the whole story.
Ratio shows the proportion of equity and debt the company uses to finance its assets, and the higher the ratio, the more debt, rather than equity, is financing the company. A high debt level compared to equity can result in volatile earnings and large interest expenses. For a more stringent test, investors sometimes use only long-term debt instead of total liabilities in the calculation above. 3. Profit margins. A company's profitability depends not only on having a good profit margin, but also on consistently increasing it. This margin is calculated by dividing net income by net sales. For a good indication of historical profit margins, investors should look back at least 5 years. A high profit margin indicates the company is executing its business well, but increasing margins mean management has been extremely efficient and successful at controlling expenses. 4. Is the company public? Buffett typically considers only companies that have been around for at least 10 years. As a result, most of the technology companies that have had their initial public offering, IPOs, in the past decade wouldn't get on Buffett's radar. He said he doesn't understand the mechanics behind many of today's technology companies, and only invests in a business that he fully understands. Value investing requires identifying companies that have stood the test of time, but are currently undervalued. Never underestimate the value of historical performance. This demonstrates the company's ability, or inability, to increase shareholder value. Do keep in mind, however, that a stock's past performance does not guarantee future performance. The value investor's job is to determine how well the company can perform as it did in the past. Determining this is inherently tricky. But, evidently, Buffett is very good at it. One important point to remember about public companies is that the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, requires that they file regular financial statements. These documents can help you analyze important company data, including current and past performance, so you can make important investment decisions.